Abigail Carter did not scream. She did not weep. She simply slid the gold ring from her finger, the ring her mother had pressed into her palm on her deathbed, and set it on the mahogany table without a sound. Behind her, the lanterns of Harrington Hall blazed bright enough to light half of Virginia. Around her, 100 guests laughed and drank and danced, and not one of them saw the moment Abigail Carter stopped being a woman who waited and became a woman who walked. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow Abigail's journey all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments below. Let me see how far this story travels. The summer of 1818 arrived in Shenandoah Valley the way it always did, sudden and suffocating, pressing down on the red clay hills like a hand flat against a chest. By mid-July, the air above Carter Ridge shimmered, and every living thing that could find shade did. Horses stood motionless under the oaks. Dogs stretched long in the dirt beneath the porch. Even the birds went quiet between noon and 3. But inside the Carter farmhouse, Abigail was not still. She had been moving since before sunrise. She'd overseen the loading of 3 supply wagons, settled a wage dispute between 2 field hands, and mended a section of fence along the eastern boundary herself when the hired man failed to show. By mid-morning, her palms were calloused red, and her dress was damp at the back. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't sat down. This was not unusual. Abigail Carter, at 27, had been the engine of the Carter household for so long that no one thought to question it. Not her father, Thomas Carter, who had grown accustomed to the farm running smoothly, the way a man grows accustomed to breathing without noticing, without gratitude. Not her younger sister, Caroline, who slept past 8 most mornings, and spent her afternoons practicing the pianoforte. Not even the field hands who had learned the hard way that Miss Abigail's word carried more weight than most men's written contracts. Abigail knew her role. She had shaped herself around it the way water shapes itself around stone, quietly, completely, until you could no longer tell where the stone ended and the water began. And tonight was the Harrington summer ball. She had exactly 2 hours to transform herself from the woman who had been mending fence lines into the woman who would enter Harrington Hall on the arm of William Harrington, one of the most powerful landowners in all of Virginia, and as of 3 months prior, her intended husband. Caroline found her at the washstand, still scrubbing clay from beneath her fingernails. "Abby!" Caroline leaned against the doorframe, already dressed, her pale yellow gown pressed to perfection, her dark hair arranged in ringlets that had taken the housemaid the better part of an hour. She was 22, and she was the kind of beautiful that people turned to look at, twice the soft, unguarded kind that made men feel large and useful. "You're not ready." "I'm aware," Abigail said. "We leave in 40 minutes. "I know when we leave, Caroline. I arranged the carriage." Caroline stepped inside and perched on the edge of the bed, watching Abigail with that particular expression she'd worn since childhood, not quite concern, not quite guilt, but something hovering between them. "Papa's already in his good coat." "Good for Papa." A pause, then softer. "Are you nervous about tonight?" Abigail stopped scrubbing and looked up at her own reflection in the small square mirror above the washstand. The woman looking back at her was not beautiful the way Caroline was beautiful. She had strong hands, dark eyes that people sometimes described as serious and sometimes described as cold, and a face that had spent too many summers in the open air to remain fashionably pale. She was not the woman men wrote poems about. She was the woman men called capable, reliable, sensible. She was the woman William Harrington had proposed to on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting across from her father at the dining table, speaking in the measured tones of a man discussing a business arrangement that happened to involve a human being. "You're a woman of sound judgment, Miss Carter," he'd said, "and I am a man who requires a woman of sound judgment at his side." Her father had shaken William's hand before Abigail had finished absorbing the words. "No," Abigail said now to her own reflection. "I'm not nervous." She believed it when she said it. Harrington Hall that night was everything William Harrington did on his property, precise, impressive, and slightly cold beneath the surface. The lawns were immaculate. The lanterns were hung at mathematically even intervals along the drive. 3 hired musicians played in the east parlor, their notes drifting out through the open windows into the thick summer night. Abigail arrived on her father's arm, Caroline a half step behind. The other guests parted slightly to watch them pass, or more accurately to watch Caroline pass, though Abigail was long past taking that particular wound personally. William met them at the entrance. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that was handsome in a way that seemed designed rather than natural, all strong jaw and straight brows and eyes the color of creek water in late autumn. He was 34, and he wore his authority the way other men wore their coats, as though it had been made specifically for him. He shook Thomas Carter's hand. He nodded to Abigail. He smiled at Caroline. The smile was different. Abigail noticed. She filed it. She moved on. "You look well, Miss Carter," William said, offering Abigail his arm. "Thank you," she said. "The East Field came in strong this year. You'll want to look at the boundary survey before harvest." Something shifted briefly behind his eyes. Not displeasure exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man who had expected a different kind of response. "There'll be time for business later," he said. "Of course," Abigail agreed. She took his arm. She smiled at the appropriate moments. She spoke to the wives of neighboring landowners about household management and the price of grain. She ate small portions of food she tasted without tasting. She was by every visible measure exactly what William Harrington had selected her to be. Competent, controlled, convenient. It was past 10 o'clock when she went looking for him. Not from suspicion. Nothing so dramatic as that. She had simply been asked by old Mrs. Whitfield to pass a message to their host about a property matter, something to do with a shared creek boundary, and it seemed faster to find William herself than to send a servant hunting through 3 parlors and a ballroom. She moved through the side hall past the library, out through the French doors that opened onto the back garden. The night air hit her like a held breath, released still warm, but alive in a way the house wasn't. She could hear the musicians faintly from inside, and somewhere nearby, frogs in the decorative pond, and closer than either voices. Low, urgent, not angry. Something worse than angry. She stopped. The garden path curved around a stand of old boxwoods, and the voices were on the other side. She did not move forward. She did not retreat. She simply stood there in the space between knowing and not knowing while the words assembled themselves in the warm Virginia night. William's voice first, "Can't keep doing this," not with the announcement so close. Then Caroline's, breathless, a little frightened the way she sounded when she was saying something she'd rehearsed. I know that. But William, lower your voice." A silence. Then William again, and this time his voice was different. The precision was still there, but underneath it something else, something raw cracked open that Abigail had never once heard him direct toward her. Abigail understands responsibility. She understands what's expected. But you, a long pause, you understand something I didn't know I was missing. The frogs kept singing. Somewhere in the house, a woman laughed at something. Abigail stood very still. She had read enough in her 27 years to understand the architecture of what she had just overheard. She had enough intelligence and enough honesty to resist the human instinct to rebuild it into something less damaging. She did not tell herself she had misunderstood. She did not manufacture an explanation. She turned around and walked back inside. The ring had been her mother's. Helena Carter had pressed it into Abigail's palm 6 years ago, 2 days before she died, when Caroline was still too young to understand what was happening, and their father sat in the hallway, unable to make himself enter the room. Abigail had been the one sitting beside the bed. Abigail had been the one holding the cup of water, smoothing the quilt staying. "This goes to you," her mother had whispered, pressing the ring into her palm. A thin gold band with a single small garnet, modest by any standard, but worn smooth from decades on Helena Carter's hand. "Not because you're the oldest, because you're the one who sees things clearly." Abigail had worn it every day since. When William had proposed, her father had suggested delicately that she might put it away, that a woman entering the Harrington household should present herself appropriately, and that a small garnet ring from a dead mother was perhaps not the right image. Abigail had refused politely, but without any room for negotiation. And William, to his credit, had said nothing about it either way. She found a table near the entrance hall. A small side table with a candle on it, the flame barely moving in the still air. She pulled off the ring. She set it on the table. She did not look at it again. She walked to the front door, asked the boy stationed there to bring around the Carter carriage, not in an hour now, and stood on the steps of Harrington Hall while the summer night pressed in around her, and the sound of music and laughter leaked out through every window. She did not cry. She was not in that moment a woman destroyed. She was a woman suddenly terribly clearly awake. The boy brought the carriage. She rode home alone. The driver, old Samuel, glanced back once through the little window between compartments, took one look at whatever was on her face, and faced forward again without a word. The house was dark when she arrived. She let herself in through the kitchen door, the one she always used, the one that didn't stick, and sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a long time. She thought about what William had said. Abigail understands responsibility. She turned the words over. She had heard them before in different shapes from different mouths. From her father, Abigail will handle it. From the field hands, ask Miss Abigail, she'll know. From the women at church. Abigail Carter is so capable, isn't she? Said the way people say, isn't she, when they mean what a pity she isn't something else instead. She had built her entire sense of herself around being the woman who handled things. And she had told herself in the quiet dark of many nights before this one that being needed was close enough to being loved. That they were different words for the same weight. Sitting at the kitchen table, she understood finally that they were not. Thomas Carter came home an hour later. He found her at the table. He lit a lamp. He looked at her, and then looked away in the way men of his generation looked away from difficult things, not from cruelty, but from a kind of practiced avoidance that had calcified into character. "Abigail," he said. "I left the ring," she said, "at Harrington Hall." A long pause. Her father pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily. "I see," he said. "I don't think you do, Papa." She kept her voice steady. "But that's all right." "Did something was there, an incident?" "Nothing I care to describe." He was quiet. He had the look of a man calculating something not out of coldness, she had come to understand over the years, but out of habit. Thomas Carter processed the world through its practical implications. Even now, she could see him turning over the social consequences, the property implications, the questions that would be asked at church on Sunday. "William he's a good match, Abby. The land alone. I know what the land is worth, Papa." She stood. "I've been managing ours for 7 years. She went upstairs to her room. She did not sleep. By morning, she had made a decision. It was not a dramatic decision. She did not pace the floor or tear her hair or write letters by candlelight. She simply lay in the gray pre-dawn and let reality settle over her the way it settles over everything in the early morning, without sentiment, without mercy. She had spent 27 years being useful. She had run the Carter farm, managed the books, negotiated with merchants, supervised harvests, and done it all while her father accepted the credit and her sister accepted the comfort. And she had done it because it was what was needed, and because she had believed somewhere beneath the practicality that the doing of it meant something, that it was love expressed in action, that someone was watching and knowing. What she understood now, sitting up in her bed with the first bird starting outside the window, was that no one had been watching. Or rather, they had been watching, and what they had seen was not her. They had seen what she could do for them. There was a difference. She dressed in her plainest work clothes. She went downstairs and made coffee. When Samuel came around to see about the morning's work, she told him she would be riding out to look at the old Holloway parcel, a piece of land 2 miles east that had belonged to her mother's family and sat empty since Helena Carter's death. "You wanting company, Miss Abigail?" Samuel asked. "No," she said. "Not today." She rode out alone, the early morning still cool before the heat arrived, and she stood at the edge of the Holloway land, weedy, neglected, bounded by broken fence, and she looked at it for a long time. Her mother had grown up on this land. No one had told Abigail much about that. The Holloway parcel was one of those things that existed in the background of her family's life without ever being addressed directly, like the marriage portrait in the upstairs hall that no one ever looked at, or her mother's locked writing box that her father had put in the cellar after Helena died and never brought back up. It was just there, part of the landscape. But Abigail remembered suddenly sitting with her mother as a child, Helena pointing out the east window toward these fields and saying something Abigail hadn't understood at the time. "That land belongs to you someday. Don't let anyone tell you different." She hadn't known what it meant then. She thought she might know now. She was still standing there, turning that memory over, when she heard hoofbeats behind her. She knew before she turned who it would be. She had half expected it, had wondered during the night whether he would come himself, or send a note, or simply pretend nothing had happened and appear at church on Sunday with that careful expression of his. William Harrington rode up and stopped his horse a few feet away. He was not in his ball clothes. He was dressed for the field, practical and unadorned, and for a moment, standing there against the early morning sky, he looked almost like a different man than the one who had presided over his party the night before. Almost. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Harrington." She did not turn to face him fully. She kept her eyes on the Holloway land. He dismounted. He was careful, deliberate in his movements, the way he was careful and deliberate about most things. She heard him step up beside her. "I came to explain." "You don't need to," she said. "Abigail." "I'd prefer Miss Carter if you don't mind." A pause. Then, "Miss Carter." His voice had shifted, not softer exactly, but stripped of its usual authority, which amounted to something similar. "What you may have heard last night, it wasn't Mr. Harrington." She turned then and looked at him directly, and whatever was on her face made him stop speaking. "I'm going to save us both a good deal of time. I'm not angry with you. I'm not going to cause a scene, or demand explanations, or write to your mother. What happened last night is your business and my sister's business, and you may conduct it however you see fit." He looked briefly like a man who had braced for a storm and found himself standing in sudden stillness. He didn't know what to do with that. "Then," he started, "but I want to be very clear about one thing," she continued. "You didn't choose my sister because you love her more than you could have loved me. You chose her because she makes you feel something you'd decided men like you weren't supposed to feel. And you chose me because I was practical and manageable, and I would have run your household so efficiently that you would never have had to think too hard about anything." She paused. "I want you to know that I understand that. And I want you to know that I am no longer available to be that for anyone." William was quiet for a long moment. "That's not entirely fair," he said at last. "Maybe not," she agreed. "But it's accurate." She turned back toward her horse. "What will you do?" he asked. She looked at the Holloway land one more time, the broken fence, the overgrown fields, the old farmhouse roof visible just over the rise. "I'm going to find out," she said. She rode away without looking back. That was the morning Abigail Carter stopped belonging to her circumstances and started belonging to herself. Back at the Carter house, her father was in the parlor when she returned. He had clearly been waiting. He stood when she came in, and his expression had the particular quality of a man who has spent the night rehearsing something and is no longer sure it was the right speech. "Abigail," he began. "I want to talk to you about the Holloway parcel," she said. He blinked. That was not what he'd expected. "The what?" "The Holloway land, Papa. Mother's family land, 2 miles east." She sat down across from him, folded her hands in her lap. "I want to know the full legal status of that property." Thomas Carter sat back down slowly. His hands moved to his knees and stayed there. "That's a complicated matter. Most things worth discussing are, Abigail said. Tell me anyway. He looked at her for a long moment. This daughter who had been running his farm for 7 years, who had never once asked him for anything except to be left alone to do the work, and something moved across his face that she couldn't quite name. We can talk about it, he said finally. Later. Yes, she agreed. We will. She stood. She walked to the window. Outside, the summer heat was building, already pressing up from the red clay earth, the way it always did, relentless and absolute. But standing there looking out at the Carter field she had tended for a decade, Abigail felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not peace exactly, not happiness, something harder and truer than either. She felt like herself. The talk started before the week was out. That was the thing about a small county in Virginia in 1818. Silence was a courtesy no one extended for long. By Wednesday, half the women in the valley knew that Abigail Carter had left the Harrington summer ball without her ring and without explanation. By Thursday, the other half had heard 3 different versions of why. And by Sunday morning, when the Carter family carriage pulled up to the churchyard, Abigail could feel the weight of every glance before she'd even stepped down to the ground. She stepped down anyway. She walked through the churchyard with her back straight, and her eyes forward the way she'd learned to walk through difficult things, not pretending they weren't there, but refusing to grant them the satisfaction of making her flinch. Her father walked beside her stiff and silent in his good coat, the expression on his face the one he reserved for situations he could not manage by writing a letter or offering a handshake. Caroline walked on her other side, eyes downcast, cheeks pale in a way that had nothing to do with the heat. No one spoke to them directly about it. That wasn't how these things were done. Instead, there were the sidelong glances, the conversations that stopped a half-beat too late, when they approached the particular warmth with which Mrs. Pendleton greeted Caroline, while finding an excuse to look elsewhere, when Abigail extended her hand. Abigail shook hands with everyone who offered theirs. She spoke about the weather and the harvest prospects and old Mr. Dunn's request for a fence easement along the southern road. She was by every observable measure fine. She was not fine, but she had decided somewhere between Thursday and Sunday that the difference between being fine and appearing fine was a gap she could afford to close for a few hours at a time, and that the closing of it was not dishonesty, it was armor, and armor had its uses. It was after the service in the yard that Martha Pendleton cornered her. Martha was not a cruel woman, precisely. She was the kind of woman who believed she was being helpful when she was being harmful, which Abigail had always found more exhausting than outright cruelty. She was 50, and she knew everything about everyone within a 12-mile radius, and she wore that knowledge the way some women wore jewelry, openly and with pride. "Abigail," she said, taking Abigail's arm with a firmness that was not quite affectionate. "I hope you know that we all think you are handling this with remarkable dignity." "I appreciate that, Mrs. Pendleton." "It must be very difficult." A pause waited with implication. "A woman your age, of course, doesn't have the luxury of, well, there will be other opportunities, I'm sure. The Whitfield boy is still unmarried, though he's only 23. Mrs. Pendleton." Abigail gently removed her arm. "I'm not currently in the market for replacement opportunities, but I'll keep the Whitfield boy in mind." She smiled pleasantly and walked away. She heard Martha Pendleton inhale sharply behind her. It was, in its small way, the finest thing that had happened to her all week. Her father caught up with her at the carriage. He glanced back once toward the churchyard, then at her, and the look on his face was not entirely unsympathetic. "You know people are going to talk." "People are already talking, Papa." She climbed into the carriage. "I'm choosing not to participate." He followed her in. The carriage rolled away from the churchyard, and for a mile or so neither of them said anything. Caroline had taken a separate ride home with the Harwick girls, a small mercy that no one had explicitly arranged, but everyone had understood was necessary. "About the Holloway land," Abigail said as they turned onto the main road. Her father shifted in his seat. "Abigail, you said we would talk about it." "I said later. It's been 5 days." She looked at him directly. "Papa, I'm not asking you to explain anything uncomfortable today. I'm asking you to tell me who holds the deed to that property and what its current legal status is. That's a practical question, and I would like a practical answer. Thomas Carter was quiet for long enough that she could hear the wheels on the road, the creak of the harness, the distant sound of a crow somewhere in the fields they were passing. Then, he said carefully, "Your mother's land was placed in a family trust at the time of our marriage." Placed by whom? By your grandfather Holloway. And who administers the trust? Another pause. Longer this time. Papa? Her voice sharpened slightly. Who administers the trust? I do, he said, as your mother's surviving spouse. The carriage rolled on. Abigail turned this over slowly, the way she turned over most things, not rushing the understanding but not flinching from it either. And when does control of that property transfer? She asked. Her father looked out the window. Papa, at the time of your marriage, he said quietly, or at such time as I choose to release it. The words dropped into the space between them and sat there. Abigail did not say anything for a long moment. She was thinking about her mother's voice. That land belongs to you someday. And about the 6 years since Helena Carter had died. And about all the mornings Abigail had ridden that boundary road without knowing what she was looking at, what she had been kept from looking at. I see, she said at last. Abigail, I want you to understand. Not today, Papa. He stopped. She looked back out her window for the rest of the ride home, and she did not cry, and she did not speak, and she thought about her mother with a ferocity that felt almost physical, as though if she thought hard enough, Helena Carter would reach back through 6 years and tell her what to do next. She didn't. But Abigail thought she knew anyway. The first thing she needed was information. The second thing she needed was someone she could trust. And the third thing, the hardest thing, was the willingness to stop waiting for permission to take her own life in her hands. She had already started on the third. She would get to the first two. Hey. Ruth Miller lived at the end of a narrow lane 3 miles from Carter Ridge in a house that had been built by her husband 30 years ago and maintained entirely by her own hands since his death. She was 61 years old, wiry and tanned, with hands that looked like they'd spent decades doing exactly what they had farming building surviving. She'd raised 4 children to adulthood on that land without a husband after 40. And the county had long since made its peace with the fact that Ruth Miller did not particularly care what the county thought. Abigail had known her distantly for years. Ruth had been friends with Helena Carter. It was one of those connections Abigail had never thought to pursue, the way you don't pursue things that seem like they belong to the past, to someone else's story, until one morning you wake up and realize the past might be exactly where your answer is buried. She rode over on a Monday just after sunrise, before the heat got serious. Ruth was in her kitchen garden when Abigail arrived. She didn't look surprised to see her. She barely looked up from what she was doing, which was pulling weeds from around a row of bean plants with the focused efficiency of someone who didn't waste movement. Abigail Carter, she said. Took you long enough. Abigail dismounted and tied her horse to the fence post. Long enough for what? To come out here. Ruth finally looked up. Her eyes were sharp dark, the kind of eyes that didn't soften the things they looked at. Your mother said you would eventually. Figured it would take something hitting you sideways. She pulled another weed and tossed it aside. Sit down if you want. I'll be done in a minute. Abigail sat on the fence rail and waited. When Ruth finally came over and dusted her hands on her apron, she looked Abigail over with the frank assessment of a woman who'd earned the right to look at people straight. You look tired, she said. I haven't been sleeping well. That's because you've been thinking too hard about what other people are going to say instead of thinking about what you're going to do. Ruth sat down across from her on the porch step. What are you going to do? Abigail had not expected to be asked quite so directly, quite so soon. She found to her own surprise that the question steadied her, instead of shaking her loose. The Holloway land, she said. My mother's land. I want to know what it would take for me to establish independent claim. Ruth's expression didn't change. "Your father tell you about the trust?" Abigail stared at her. "You knew. Helena told me, years ago." Ruth met her gaze without apology. She worried about it. She knew your father wasn't a bad man, but she also knew he was the kind of man who arranges things to suit himself without quite realizing that's what he's doing. She wrote everything down. All of it. What the trust contained, the terms your grandfather set, the boundaries of the property. She went inside, and came back 2 minutes later with a worn leather satchel that she held out to Abigail like a thing she'd been holding in safekeeping for a very long time. "She left this with me." Abigail took the satchel. Her hands were steady. She didn't know how they were steady, but they were. "Why didn't you give this to me before?" "Because before, you weren't ready to do anything with it." Ruth sat back down. "You were too busy keeping everyone else's life running to have time to start your own." A pause. "Are you ready now?" Abigail thought about the churchyard on Sunday. She thought about Martha Pendleton's hand on her arm, and the particular kindness of cruelty wrapped in sympathy. She thought about William Harrington's voice in the garden, stripped of its formality, full of something he'd never once shown her. She thought about the Holloway land and the broken fence, and her mother's voice pressing up through 6 years of silence. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." The satchel contained 17 pages in Helena Carter's handwriting. Careful. Measured the handwriting of a woman who knew she was writing something that needed to last. There were the original trust documents, or copies of them annotated in her mother's hand. There was a surveyor's description of the Holloway parcel dated 1801. There was a letter unsealed addressed to Abigail by name that had clearly been written and rewritten more than once before the final version was committed to paper. Abigail read the letter 3 times before she moved on to the legal documents. She didn't share what it said with anyone. Some things were too private to survive being spoken aloud. But by the time she rode home that evening with the satchel tied to her saddle and the heat pressing down and the long shadows of late afternoon striping the road, she understood 2 things she hadn't understood that morning. The first was that her mother had loved her in a way that was deeper and more deliberate than Abigail had known, had been protecting her quietly with the only tools available to a woman who understood her own limits. The second was that Thomas Carter had known for 6 years that his daughter had independent means she was entitled to, and he had said nothing. Not from hatred, not from cruelty, but from need and habit, and the quiet certainty of a man who had come to rely on something so completely that he'd stopped being able to see it as belonging to anyone but himself. That evening, she sat with her father in the parlor after supper. Caroline had gone to bed early. The house was quiet. Thomas Carter was reading, or pretending to read, and Abigail sat across from him with her hands folded and the leather satchel on the table beside her, and she waited until he could no longer sustain the pretense of not noticing it. He lowered his book. He looked at the satchel. He looked at her. "Ruth Miller," he said. "Yes." The silence between them was the kind that had weight. He set his book down carefully, the way he did with things he wanted to handle without breaking. "Abigail, I'm not angry with you, Papa." She kept her voice even, not warm, not cold, something more sustainable than either. "I want you to know that. I understand why you made the choices you made. I'm not even certain you made them consciously." She paused. "But I need you to hear what I'm saying." He nodded slowly. "I've been running this farm for 7 years, she said. "The books, the workers, the negotiations, the planting schedules, the boundary disputes, all of it. And in that same time, I have been living as though I had no future that didn't involve being handed to someone else. As though my value was only in what I could manage for the family." She let that sit. "Mama didn't want that for me. She said so, and she was right." Her father's jaw tightened, not in anger, in something harder to name. "I needed you here, Abigail." "I know you did." She looked at him steadily. "But needing me here is not the same as it being my choice to stay." The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, a night bird called once and went quiet. "The Holloway parcel," she said. "I want to begin the process of taking stewardship of that land. I'm not asking you to sign anything tonight. I'm telling you what I intend to do so that it doesn't come as a surprise." She stood. "I think that's more courtesy than you gave me." She picked up the satchel. She went to bed. Thomas Carter sat in the parlor for a very long time after she went upstairs, and Abigail, lying awake and listening to the silence of the house, did not feel guilty about leaving him there. She felt for the second time in a week like herself. What followed was not dramatic. It was not fast. It was the kind of hard, ordinary daily work that doesn't make for thrilling stories, but makes for real lives. And Abigail had always been better at real than she was at thrilling. She rode out to the Holloway parcel every morning for 2 weeks. She walked the full boundary line, checking it against her grandfather's survey. She noted every breach in the fencing, every section of the old farmhouse roof that had gone soft, every acre that had gone to weed and scrub in the years of neglect. She made lists. She calculated costs. She went to the county land office in town and spent an afternoon with a clerk named Mr. Prescott, who was visibly uncertain what to do with a woman asking detailed questions about trust administration, but who answered her anyway, because she asked with the quiet authority of someone who already knew what the answers should be and was merely verifying them. The county noticed, of course. The county always noticed. She stopped in at the general store one morning for supplies, and Mrs. Aiken at the counter watched her lay out her list and said in the tone of someone performing concern while dispensing gossip, "I hear you've been riding out to the old Holloway place, Abigail, all alone." "Yes, ma'am," Abigail said. "That's a lot of land for a woman to be managing by herself." "It's about the same amount of land I've been managing at Carter Ridge for 7 years, Abigail said. "Just a different parcel." Mrs. Aiken blinked. "Well, yes, but you don't have a husband to what exactly?" The question hung. Mrs. Aiken gathered herself. "To help with the practical matters. I have 2 hands a horse and a working knowledge of Virginia land law," Abigail said. "That covers most of the practical matters I've encountered so far." She took her supplies. "Thank you, Mrs. Aiken. Give my regards to your husband." She was halfway to the door when Mrs. Aiken said, not quite under her breath, "What a peculiar woman she's becoming." Abigail let the door close behind her and stood on the step in the full July sun, and permitted herself exactly 3 seconds of feeling how much that stung, because it did sting, and pretending it didn't would have been a different kind of dishonesty. And then she untied her horse and rode back toward the Holloway land. She had fence posts to assess. It was on a Thursday, the 3rd week of July, that William Harrington rode up to the Holloway boundary. She was on the far side of the east fence, had just knelt down to check the condition of a rotted post, and she heard the horse before she heard him. She stood, brushed her hands against her skirt, and turned around. He looked, she thought, like a man who'd rehearsed what he was going to say and had lost confidence in the speech somewhere on the ride over. He was alone. No servants, no purpose she could identify. Just William Harrington on a good horse at the edge of land that didn't belong to him, looking at her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before, something close to uncertainty. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Harrington." He dismounted. He didn't come through the fence, he stayed on his side of it, which she noted and which she was willing to grant him as a small point in his favor. "I won't take much of your time." "All right." He looked at the post she'd been examining, then at the field beyond her, then back at her. "People in the county are saying things," he said, "about your intentions here. I'm aware. They're saying you've gone—" He stopped. "Peculiar," she offered. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Something like that." "And you came out here to tell me that?" "No." He said it quickly, with an emphasis that surprised her. "No, I came—" He stopped again, and for a moment he looked less like a powerful Virginia landowner and more like a man standing at the edge of something he wasn't sure how to cross. "I came to tell you that what you're doing here is sound, agronomically. The soil on the eastern section is good, better than Carter Ridge, actually. If you drain the low corner near the creek and rotate properly, you'll have a productive farm within 2 seasons. Abigail stared at him. She had expected excuses. She had expected explanations, justifications, maybe an appeal to social reasonableness. She had not expected agricultural advice delivered with the serious practicality of a man who had looked up her land and thought carefully about it. "I know," she said after a moment. "The fence line on the north boundary runs about 6 feet inside the actual surveyed property," he said. "Your grandfather's survey and the current fence don't match. You're losing a strip of good land." "I know that too." He nodded, like she'd passed some kind of test he'd quietly administered. "All right." He gathered his reins. "Then you don't need me to tell you anything." He was almost turned around when she said, "Why did you look it up?" He stopped. She hadn't planned to ask, but the question was already out. William Harrington turned back, and this time the expression on his face was one she couldn't categorize neatly. Not guilt exactly, not pity, something more complicated. "Because you were always worth more attention than I gave you," he said. "And I'd like to do better on that count if you'll allow it." The sun was overhead and the heat was absolute, and somewhere in the field behind her a meadowlark was singing, and Abigail stood at the broken fence of her mother's land and looked at William Harrington for a long, clear-eyed moment. "You can allow yourself whatever you like, Mr. Harrington," she said. "What I'll allow is a separate question." She turned back to her fence post. He rode away. She didn't watch him go, but she heard the hoofbeats for longer than she expected, fading slowly down the road, and her hands were steady on the rotted wood, and her heart was doing something she chose not to examine too closely. Not yet. Not today. Not while there was still a fence post to deal with, and the sun was this high, and she had not yet earned the right to be confused about William Harrington. There would be time. It was Ruth who named the thing Abigail was struggling to name. She'd taken to riding over to Ruth's 2 mornings a week, partly for the practical wisdom the older woman offered freely and without embellishment, and partly because Ruth Miller's kitchen was one of the few places in the county where Abigail felt she could stop performing, being fine, and simply be whatever she actually was that day. On this particular morning, she told Ruth about William's visit. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Abigail most valued about her. When Abigail finished, Ruth poured herself more coffee and said, "What did you feel when he rode up?" "Cautious." "That's what you decided to feel. What did you actually feel?" Abigail looked at her cup. "I don't know." "Yes, you do." A long pause. The kitchen was warm and smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, and the honest smell of a house that worked. "I felt," she started and stopped. "I felt seen," she said at last. "Which is ridiculous. He came to tell me something about a fence line. He came because he was thinking about you," Ruth said. "And you know the difference between a man who shows up to smooth things over and a man who shows up because he genuinely couldn't stay away. You've always known the difference. You just haven't let yourself apply it to yourself." She set her cup down. "The question isn't whether William Harrington is changing. The question is whether you're going to let what happened between you make you blind to it either way. I can't just forget what I heard in that garden." "No," Ruth agreed. "You shouldn't. But people used your strength for years, Abigail, and got comfortable doing it. That doesn't mean no one can ever see you clearly. It just means you have to raise the standard for what clearly looks like." She looked at her with those sharp, unsentimental eyes. "William Harrington showing up at your fence line and talking to you about soil drainage is not a declaration. It's a start. And you don't have to decide what to do with a start until it becomes more than that." Abigail sat with that for a while. "My father wants to talk about the trust," she said eventually. "I know. Thomas came to see me." Abigail looked up sharply. "He came to you 3 days ago." Ruth said it without drama. "He wanted to know if I thought he'd done wrong by you. I told him he needed to ask you that question, not me. And I told him that the answer he got was going to depend on whether he was asking because he was sorry or because he wanted to be told he wasn't. She picked up her cup again. I expect you'll be hearing from him. Abigail thought about her father in the parlor that night, sitting alone after she'd gone to bed. She thought about the way he'd looked at the satchel, not with anger, not with the defensiveness of someone caught in wrongdoing, but with the particular expression of a man seeing clearly, maybe for the first time, the shape of his own assumptions. She had not forgiven him. She was not sure she was ready to, but she understood him. She thought well enough to talk to him, and understanding was a place to start. She rode home in the full midday heat with the satchel on her saddle, and Ruth Miller's voice in her ear, and the steady, unspectacular, real feeling of a life being rebuilt from the ground up, one post, one conversation, one decision at a time. The Holloway land was waiting. She was not going to make it wait any longer. Thomas Carter came to her on a Saturday morning. Not the following Saturday. Not a week after Ruth had warned her, but that same evening, 3 hours after Abigail had ridden home from Ruth's kitchen in the midday heat, still turning over everything the older woman had said. She was in the small room off the kitchen she'd converted into a working office years ago. The room her father never entered because the books and ledgers and land surveys that filled it represented a version of his daughter he'd always found more convenient to benefit from than to look at directly. He knocked. That alone stopped her. Thomas Carter had not knocked on a door in this house in 20 years. He opened doors, closed, then passed through them. He did not knock. "Come in," she said. He came in, and he stood in the doorway of the room that was entirely hers, and he looked around at it, the stacked ledgers, the hand-drawn boundary maps, the surveyor's notes pinned to the wall above the desk, with an expression that Abigail had never seen on his face before. Not the discomfort of a man entering unfamiliar territory. Something more honest than that. The look of a man recognizing a place he should have visited long ago. "I went to see Ruth Miller," he said. "I know. She told me." He nodded. He moved to the chair across from her desk, the small wooden one that she kept there for the occasional field hand who needed to go over something with her. And he sat in it heavily, the way a man sits when he's been carrying something for a long time, and has finally decided to set it down even if he doesn't yet know where. "I need to tell you something," he said. Abigail set down her pen. She folded her hands on the desk. She waited. "The trust your grandfather established," he began, "was written specifically to ensure that the Holloway land transferred to you, not to the family, not to me, not contingent on your marriage to you directly on your 25th birthday." He paused. "That was 2 years ago." The room was very quiet. "You've known for 2 years," Abigail said. "Yes." "And you said nothing." "No." She looked at her father. He met her eyes without flinching, and that she realized was its own kind of courage, the hard, late kind. "Why?" she said. "Because—" He stopped, tried again. "Because you were here and you were managing everything, and every time I thought about telling you, I thought about what would happen when you left. Not to the farm. To me." His voice dropped slightly at that last word. Not to dramatize it. Just because the truth sometimes got quieter when it got more honest. "I thought about this house without you running it, and I convinced myself it wasn't the right time. And then more time passed, and it became harder to say, and eventually I had simply not said it. And I told myself that was different from hiding it." Abigail was silent for a long moment. "Was it?" she asked. Her father looked at his hands. "No," he said. "It wasn't." She had expected when this conversation came, and she had known it was coming, had felt it gathering like weather, that she would feel the full force of the anger she'd been carefully managing for weeks. She'd expected it to arrive with the relief of a storm finally breaking. But sitting across from her father in her own office, looking at a man who was not monstrous, but merely human, in the most disappointing and recognizable way, she felt something else instead. She felt tired. And underneath the tired, like bedrock underneath soil, something that was not forgiveness yet, but was the precondition for it, the decision to understand before she judged. "I am not going to tell you it's all right," she said, "because it isn't. You took 2 years from me, Papa. 2 years of knowing I had choices. 2 years of thinking my only path forward was to be managed into someone else's life. She kept her voice level. I want you to understand what that cost. I do, he said. I'm not sure you can, she said. But I believe you think you do, and right now, that has to be enough. She picked up her pen again. I'm going to speak to Mr. Prescott at the land office on Monday about initiating the transfer of stewardship. I'd like you to cooperate with that process. I will, he said, and I'd like you to not make me ask twice for anything related to this. I won't. She looked up at him. For a moment, he was not her father. The landowner, the widower, the man who'd run Carter Ridge with the particular authority of someone who'd never been seriously questioned. He was just Thomas Carter, 60 years old, sitting in a chair that was too small for him in a room that belonged to his daughter, accounting for himself. I love you, Papa, she said. That isn't in question, but I am going to take what's mine, and I need you to let me do that without making it harder than it has to be. He nodded once. He stood and he straightened his coat and he walked to the door, and then he stopped with his hand on the frame and said without turning around, Your mother would be proud of you. She always said you saw things clearly. A pause. She was right. He left. Abigail sat at her desk and did not move for a long time. The evening light was changing in the window. Somewhere outside, Samuel was finishing up with the horses for the night. The farm was doing what it always did, cycling through its routine requiring attention, demanding presence. She was no longer going to give it hers. Not all of it, not the center of herself. That belonged to her now. She picked up her pen and went back to work. Monday came, and with it, Mr. Prescott. He was a thin, careful man with ink-stained fingers and the slightly harried expression of someone who managed more paperwork than his office was designed to hold. He received Abigail in the land office with the cautious courtesy of a man who couldn't quite decide which category she belonged to. She was gentry enough to be polite to independent enough to be uncertain about, and clearly informed enough to make deflection impossible. She laid her grandfather's trust documents on his desk. She laid her mother's annotated copies beside them. She laid the surveyor's description and her own boundary notes beside those. Mr. Prescott looked at the stack of documents and then looked at her. Miss Carter, he said, this is quite comprehensive. Yes, she said, it is. I'd like to discuss the transfer timeline. He adjusted his spectacles and bent over the documents, and for the next hour and a half, they went through it page by page, the original trust language, the terms of transfer, the question of whether the 2-year delay in notification constituted any legal complication, and what documentation would be required to complete the process. When they were done, Mr. Prescott sat back in his chair and looked at her with an expression that had shifted by degrees from cautious to something closer to genuine respect. Miss Carter, he said, in my 22 years at this office, I have not had a woman come in with this level of preparation. That's useful to know, Abigail said. What does it mean for the timeline? He almost smiled. It means the process should be straightforward. 3 weeks, perhaps 4. 3, Abigail said. I'll do my best. She thanked him, gathered her documents, and walked out into the full morning heat with the steady, clean feeling of something that had been locked, being opened at last. Not flung wide, carefully, deliberately opened with a key that had always been hers. She was almost to her horse when she heard footsteps behind her on the wooden walkway. She turned. Caroline. Her sister was standing 10 feet away, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. Caroline looked not the way she'd looked on the night of the ball or at church the Sunday after, or in any of the carefully managed family silences of the past 3 weeks. She looked plain, uncalculated. She looked like a 22-year-old girl who hadn't been sleeping well and who had clearly come into town for the purpose of finding her sister and who had found her and now didn't quite know what to say. I've been trying to talk to you, Caroline said. I know, Abigail said. You've been avoiding me. Yes. Carolyn's chin came up slightly at the directness of that not offended exactly, but recalibrating. She was used to Abigail managing her feelings for her, smoothing the path, making the difficult thing easier to walk through. Abigail, standing still and honest, was not the version of her sister Caroline knew how to navigate. "Can we?" Caroline gestured vaguely toward the bench outside the dry goods store. "Please." Abigail considered. Then she tied her horse and walked to the bench and sat down, and Caroline sat beside her. And for a moment, the street life of the county town moved around them like water around two rocks. "I didn't plan it," Caroline said. "What happened with William? I want you to know that." "I believe you," Abigail said. "You didn't plan it. Things with William were never planned with me either. I was selected. There's a difference." She kept her voice neutral. "I'm not angry with you about your feelings, Caroline." "Then what are you angry about?" Abigail looked at her sister. "That you knew he felt that way about you before that night. I think you'd known for a while, and you said nothing." Caroline's silence was its own answer. "You said nothing," Abigail continued, "because it was more comfortable to say nothing. Because the arrangement suited everyone. It suited Papa, it suited William in his way, and it suited you to stay in a situation you hadn't chosen, but also hadn't refused." She paused. "And I walked around thinking I was building a future, when really, I was just being used to hold a shape that everyone else found convenient." Caroline's eyes were bright. "Abby, I'm not saying this to punish you." Abigail turned to look at her fully. "I'm saying it because I've spent 3 weeks trying to understand what happened, and I've understood most of it, and the piece that still costs me is not that William loved someone else. I think if I'm honest, that I always knew what I had with him wasn't love, not the real kind. The piece that costs me is that my own sister watched it happen and let me walk into that ballroom wearing Mama's ring." Caroline put her face in her hands. She did not cry dramatically. She just sat there behind her hands for a long moment. And then she lowered them and looked at Abigail with red eyes and said very quietly, "I'm sorry, Abby. I am truly sorry." Abigail looked at her for a long moment. At the sister she'd been managing for so long that she'd sometimes forgotten what it felt like to simply be beside her. "I know you are," she said. "Can you forgive me?" "Not yet," Abigail said. "But I'm working on it. That's the honest answer, and I think you deserve an honest answer more than you deserve a comfortable one." Caroline nodded. She wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Everyone's saying you've gone and decided to live alone out at Mama's land." "That's not far wrong. Abby?" Caroline's voice had something new in it, not the pleading of someone who wanted to be managed, but something more genuine. Something approaching the kind of attention a younger sister owes an older one. "Are you going to be all right?" Abigail thought about that question. She thought about the land office and Mr. Prescott and the 3 weeks. She thought about Ruth Miller and the leather satchel and her mother's handwriting on 17 pages. She thought about fence posts and soil surveys and the crack in the Holloway farmhouse roof that she'd already calculated the material cost to repair. "Yes," she said. "I think I am." She untied her horse and rode out of town, and she did not look back at her sister sitting on the bench, but she could feel like a knot loosening very slowly in her chest, the beginning of something that might one day become forgiven. The work on the Holloway land began the following week. Abigail hired 2 men from the County brothers James and Henry Sutton, who'd been recommended by Ruth as reliable, and importantly, men who didn't seem to have an opinion about who told them what to do, as long as the pay was fair and the instructions were clear. She gave both in spades. She arrived at the Holloway property every morning before they did, and she left after they did, and she worked alongside them more often than she directed from a distance, because she had found over 7 years of running Carter Ridge that the fastest way to earn a working man's honest effort was to let him see you weren't above the work yourself. The fence came first, then the drainage cut on the low east corner, then the roof. By the 3rd week of July, the Holloway farmhouse was no longer leaking, and the fence line matched the surveyed boundary, and the east field had been turned and was ready for a late-season planting of winter wheat if the weather held. People drove by. They always did in that county. A woman establishing an independent farm was apparently more interesting than almost anything else available that season, and Abigail had become, without exactly seeking it, the subject of considerable discussion. Some of it was hostile Mrs. Aiken's variety, the slightly fascinated disapproval of people who found independent women threatening in a way they couldn't fully articulate. Some of it was neutral, and some of it she was finding was something she hadn't expected: admiration. Quiet, carefully offered from women who couldn't say outright what they meant. Farm wives and merchant widows, and the younger daughters of families who'd watched Abigail Carter walk into a land office with a stack of documents and walk out with a transfer timeline, and who were doing the quiet private arithmetic of what that might mean for their own lives. She noticed it. She didn't comment on it. She filed it the way she filed most things. It was Ruth who brought it to her attention, directly arriving one afternoon at the Holloway property, uninvited, and standing at the edge of the east field, watching Abigail and Henry Sutton argue companionably about the best row spacing for winter wheat. When Henry moved off to mark the first line, Ruth walked over and said, "You've become interesting to people." "I've been interesting to people since I left a ring on a table at the Harrington ball," Abigail said. "Different kind of interesting," Ruth said. "Before you were a scandal. Now you're a possibility." Abigail looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean that 3 women have asked me about you in the past week alone. Not gossiping, asking. Lucy Marsh, whose husband drinks away half what she earns selling eggs. Margaret Fitch, whose father wants to marry her to old Cornelius Dell." Ruth paused. "Young Ellen Hodge, who's 17, and who doesn't know yet what shape her life is going to take, but who's watching yours and taking notes." Abigail didn't say anything for a moment. "I'm not a pattern for anyone else to follow," she said. "I'm just doing what makes sense." "Abigail." Ruth's voice had the particular dryness of someone making a point they've already made several times in slightly different forms. "What makes sense is what changes things, not what's dramatic, not what's easy. What makes sense?" She tilted her head toward the east field. "You're making sense visible to people who needed to see it. That matters." Abigail turned back to the field. Henry Sutton had finished marking the first row and was looking at her for direction. 8 inches apart," she called. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She turned back to Ruth and found the older woman watching her with something in her expression that was not sentiment exactly. Ruth didn't deal much in sentiment, but was close enough to pride that Abigail felt it in her chest. "Don't tell me I'm doing something important," Abigail said. "I'm planting winter wheat." "Yes, you are," Ruth agreed, and walked back toward her horse. It was on a Thursday at the end of the 3rd week that the second twist came. Not from William, not from her father or Caroline or anyone in the familiar geography of her disrupted life. It came from Mr. Prescott, who appeared at the Holloway property on horseback in the late afternoon, looking like a man who had discovered something in a document that he didn't quite know how to deliver in person. Abigail saw his expression and stopped what she was doing. "Mr. Prescott," she said. "What is it?" She didn't ask it as a question. He heard that, and he straightened, and he got directly to the point, credit to him. "Miss Carter," he said, "in reviewing the full trust documentation in preparation for the transfer, I've found something that was not included in the copies your mother left with Mrs. Miller." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "A codicil added by your grandfather to the original trust in 1810, 2 years before his death." Abigail took the paper. She read it. She read it twice. "This says the property boundaries extend to the creek," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "The current fence, even corrected, sits 40 yards short of the creek." "Yes, ma'am." She looked up. "That puts the south corner of the Harrington property inside the original Holloway boundary." Mr. Prescott folded his hands over his saddle horn. "A portion of it, yes. About 12 acres according to the survey marks. It appears that when the Harrington land was purchased from the Henley family in 1809, Abigail said. She was already thinking. In 1809, yes, the boundary survey used did not account for the Holloway codicil. which hadn't been recorded properly at the county level at that point. Your grandfather was... He hesitated. He was not organized, Abigail said evenly. I know. The short version is that 12 acres currently farmed as Harrington property are under the original trust terms, Holloway land. He paused. Which transfers to you. Abigail stood very still in the late afternoon, with the folded document in her hands, and the Sutton brothers working behind her, and the Holloway farmhouse solid at her back. And she thought about what this meant. 12 acres. Good acres. She knew those acres had ridden that boundary dozens of times in the past month without knowing what she was looking at. Acres that had been worked into the Harrington property for 9 years, as though they'd always been his. She thought about William Harrington riding up to her fence line. She thought about him talking to her about soil drainage. She thought about the uncertainty on his face. He didn't know. She was almost certain of that. William Harrington was not a dishonest man, calculating, yes, careful, absolutely, but not dishonest in the deliberate way. If he'd known he was farming someone else's land, he would have addressed it. She didn't know him well, but she knew that much. This will need to be disclosed, she said. Yes, Mr. Prescott agreed. To him directly. That would be the appropriate process. She folded the paper again and held it in both hands and made a decision in the space of about 15 seconds, the kind of decision that looks fast but is actually the product of everything that came before it. All the mornings at this fence line, and all the evenings at Ruth Miller's table, and all the long nights of learning what she actually was and actually believed. I'll tell him myself, she said. Mr. Prescott nodded, looking mildly relieved. That's probably wisest. She sent word that evening by Samuel, a brief note formal, requesting that William Harrington receive her at a convenient time on a matter of property documentation. No details. She kept it plain. His response came back within the hour. Tomorrow morning. 8 o'clock. At the boundary. Not at his house. At the boundary, her boundary, the line between their properties. As though he understood already instinctively that on a matter concerning her land, the ground should be hers. She read his note twice. She did not know what to do with him. She hadn't known for weeks, and this new development wasn't going to simplify anything. But she set the note down on her desk with the careful deliberateness of someone placing a thing they intend to come back to, and she went to bed, and she slept better than she had since the night of the Harrington ball. He was there before 8. She saw his horse at the fence line from 100 yards away when she rode up in the early gray light, and something shifted in her, not softened. Nothing so simple as that, but shifted, adjusted. The way your eyes adjust when you come from dark into light and things stop being shapes and start being what they actually are. She rode up and dismounted and faced him across the fence. He was watching her with that expression she'd begun to catalog, the one that had appeared on his face at the ball, and hadn't quite left the one that stripped out the performance of William Harrington, the landowner, and showed something more uncertain and more real underneath. He had his hat in his hands. It was a small gesture, but she noticed it. Miss Carter, he said. Mr. Harrington. She pulled out the folded document. I received something from Mr. Prescott yesterday that you need to see. She held it out. He took it. He read it. She watched his face while he read. He was not a man who showed things easily. But the sequence was visible comprehension, then recalculation, then something that looked in its early form like discomfort. Not the discomfort of being caught. The discomfort of realizing you've been wrong about something in a way that has real consequences for someone else. 12 acres, he said. Yes. I didn't know. I know you didn't. He looked up at the straightforwardness of it. She thought the lack of accusation. The Henley survey missed this entirely. The codicil wasn't properly recorded when your land was purchased. Mr. Prescott confirmed it. William folded the document and held it and stood for a moment in the morning light with the expression of a man genuinely and fully reckoning with something. I'll cooperate completely with the adjustment, he said, whatever the legal process requires. I know, she said, and she did. He looked at her. You knew I would. I thought you would. I was fairly confident, but not certain. I'm never fully certain about people, Mr. Harrington. She took the document back. I've learned to revise as I get more information. He was quiet for a moment. The morning was brightening, the heat already building even at this hour, and they were standing at the fence line with 3 weeks of distance between them and the summer pressing in, and he said, "You came to tell me yourself. You didn't send it through Prescott or through your father. You deserve to hear it from me." Why? She considered the question seriously. Because whatever else has happened between us, I don't want to be someone who uses a legal instrument to make a point. This is a property matter. I'm treating it as one. He nodded slowly. And if I hadn't cooperated, if I'd pushed back, hired my own surveyor, contested the codicil, I would have let Mr. Prescott handle it through the appropriate process, she said. And I would have thought somewhat less of you. He almost smiled. Not the social smile he'd worn at the ball, something smaller, more genuine, and therefore in its way more striking. "Miss Carter," he said, "you are the most honest person in this county." "Most people in this county find that inconvenient," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "They do." A pause. "I have found it clarifying." She looked at him across the fence. At the man who had called her responsible and sensible and practical, and who was standing here now at 8 in the morning with his hat in his hands, and who had looked up her land, and who had come to her fence line uninvited to talk about soil drainage. She thought about Ruth Miller saying it's a start. She thought about all the mornings she'd spent on this land in the last 3 weeks, becoming herself slowly and without audience, and without anyone's permission. She was not ready to let him in. Not today. Not yet. But she noticed carefully that the fence between them was a boundary she had built, and that she was the one who got to decide, in her own time, what came through it. "I'll have Mr. Prescott send you the formal documentation next week," she said. "I'll receive it," he said. "And Miss Carter." He stopped. She waited. He put his hat back on. "Thank you," he said, "for telling me yourself." She nodded once. She got back on her horse. She rode toward the Holloway farmhouse without looking back, but she felt in the way that you feel things you're not yet ready to name. That the morning had shifted something. Not between her and William, not yet, but inside herself. Some small, final loosening of the certainty that the people who had looked past her could never learn to see. She was not forgiving that quickly. She was not that naive, but she was. She realized, riding toward her own house on her own land in the rising heat of a Virginia morning, beginning very carefully to stay open to the possibility that learning was real, and change was real, and people were more than the worst moment you'd seen them in. She had learned that about herself these past weeks. It seemed only fair to allow for it in others. The Holloway farmhouse came into view over the rise. The new shingles on the roof caught the early light. The east field was turned and waiting. The fence ran true to the surveyed line. She had built this. No one had handed it to her, managed it for her, arranged it to suit themselves. She had done it with her own hands, and her mother's documents, and Ruth Miller's coffee, and 3 weeks of refusing to be less than she was. She dismounted and tied her horse and stood for a moment looking at what she'd made, and she felt clean. Not healed, not done, not finished with the hard parts, but clean the way you feel when you've told the truth and done the right thing, and the morning is still young, and the work is still waiting, and you are, for the first time, in as long as you can remember, exactly where you chose to be. She rolled up her sleeves. She went to work. The formal documentation arrived at Harrington Hall on a Wednesday. Mr. Prescott delivered it personally, which was his way of signaling that the matter carried weight beyond ordinary paperwork. He was a man who sent clerks for ordinary things, and went himself for the ones that required a human face attached to the news. William received him in the study, read through every page while Prescott sat across from him in patient silence and signed the acknowledgement of boundary adjustment without a single objection or a single request for delay. Prescott told Abigail this the following morning when she stopped by the land office to confirm the process was moving forward. He told it to her the way he'd been telling her things for the past several weeks, with a certain careful respect, like a man recalibrating an instrument he'd initially set wrong. He didn't contest a word of it, Prescott said. Signed the acknowledgement same day. Good, Abigail said. She meant it without drama. Prescott looked at her over his spectacles. Miss Carter, in my experience, men of Mr. Harrington's position do not typically respond to unexpected land adjustments with that kind of, he searched for the word, equanimity. No, she agreed. They don't. She did not say more than that. She thanked Mr. Prescott, tucked her copy of the signed acknowledgement into the satchel, and walked out into the August heat. She thought about William signing that paper without argument, and she felt the thing she always felt when people showed themselves clearly. Not warmth, not yet, but the honest recognition of a person doing the right thing when it cost him something. 12 acres was not nothing. 12 good acres farmed for 9 years, built into his property's working rhythm. He hadn't fought it for a single day. She filed that. She kept moving. There was still too much to do to spend long looking at what William Harrington was or wasn't becoming. The Holloway land had a name. Now she'd started calling it the Holloway Farm, in her own head, which felt right and small, and hers, which was exactly the point. The winter wheat was in the ground. The south drainage cut was holding. The farmhouse was watertight for the first time in years, and she had moved a portion of her working life out to it. The books, the daily ledgers, the morning ride that now ended here instead of at Carter Ridge. She had not fully moved out of her father's house. That was still in front of her. But she was spending more time at the Holloway farm than she was at Carter Ridge, and her father had said nothing about it, and she had taken his silence as the most generous thing he currently knew how to offer. It was on a Friday, in the first week of August, that William Harrington showed up at the Holloway farm for the first time since the boundary morning. She was on the roof, not because it needed more work, the shingles were done, but because she'd gone up to check the chimney cap, which James Sutton had installed crooked, and which she'd decided to correct herself rather than wait for him to come back around. She heard the horse below and looked down, and there was William Harrington staring up at her from the ground, with an expression she would have found funny if she'd been in a more generous mood. Miss Carter, he said carefully. Mr. Harrington? She kept working the chimney cap. I'll be down in a few minutes. A pause. Is there someone who could... I'm already up here, she said. She heard him exhale. She couldn't tell if it was concern or exasperation or both, and she found she was mildly curious about which one it was, which was its own kind of information about where she currently stood. She came down when she was finished, not before. She dusted her hands and looked at him, and he looked back at her the way he'd been looking at her lately, like a man who had walked into a room he'd been in 100 times and found it completely rearranged and was still adjusting. What can I do for you? She said. I wanted to discuss the boundary adjustment, he said, not to contest it. He added the last part quickly, hearing how it could sound. The 12 acres, there's a fence that currently runs wrong. I want to offer my men to help correct it. Abigail considered him. Why? Because it's my responsibility. The fence was built to a wrong survey on my end. The fence can be corrected by my men, she said. I know it can. He turned his hat in his hands. She noticed he'd started doing that, the hat in the hands, and looked at her with the directness that he was. She was beginning to understand. Not naturally inclined toward, but was working toward visibly like a man learning a language he'd neglected. I'd like to help. Not because you need it, because I owe you the labor. It was the precision of that made her pause. Not, I want to help. Not, let me assist. He'd said he owed her the labor, a specific thing, practically stated with no sentiment wrapped around it. He was speaking her language. She didn't know if he'd figured that out or stumbled into it, but either way, it landed differently than his previous attempts. You can send 2 men Monday morning, she said. James Sutton will direct them. I won't have a crowd. 2 men Monday, he repeated. And Mr. Harrington. She looked at him steadily. I appreciate the gesture. I want you to know I'm receiving it as what it is, an acknowledgement of a practical debt. Nothing more complicated than that for now. He held her gaze. Understood. He left. She went back to her chimney cap, but she was thinking about the way he'd said, "I owe you the labor," and about the hat in his hands, and about the specific quality of a man who was accustomed to being right and was learning to be wrong. And she thought it was one of the more difficult things a person could teach themselves, and that most people never managed it at all. She was not softening. She was being accurate. There was, as she had told her father, a difference. Ruth Miller laughed when Abigail told her about the chimney cap. Not unkindly. The kind of laugh that says, "I see exactly what's happening here, and it's both serious and a little bit wonderful, and I'm going to laugh for just one moment before I say the serious thing." "He looked up at you on the roof," Ruth said. "Yes." "And you made him wait." "I was fixing the chimney cap." "Abigail." "I was," Abigail said without flinching. The chimney cap was crooked. Ruth shook her head, still half smiling. "All right, the chimney cap was crooked." She poured more coffee. "What did you think of him when you came down?" "I thought he was trying." Abigail wrapped both hands around her cup. "Genuinely trying, not performing it. And I don't know what to do with that yet." Ruth was quiet for a moment, the productive kind of quiet that meant she was deciding how much to say. "Do you want my opinion? I wouldn't be here at 7 in the morning if I didn't." "You already know how you feel about him," Ruth said. "You've known for at least 2 weeks. You're not confused about your feelings, Abigail. You're frightened of them. Which is different, and which I think you already know." Abigail set her cup down. She didn't deny it. That was the thing about Ruth denying things in her kitchen, felt pointless the way lying feels pointless to a person who can see through you without effort. "What frightened me before," she said slowly, "was that I confused being needed for being loved. I shaped myself into what was useful and called it enough." She paused. "What frightens me now is the opposite. That I'll see what I want to see in him because I'm lonely, and he's showing up, and showing up is most of what it takes after a certain point." "That's a fair concern," Ruth said. "I don't want to be a woman who gets won over by a man doing the minimum." "No," Ruth agreed. "You don't. But there's a difference between the minimum and what William Harrington has been doing." She leveled her gaze. "He signed 12 acres away without a word. He sent men to fix a fence. He shows up at your boundary line and talks to you about soil. He is not doing the minimum. He's doing something that costs him something, his pride mostly, which is a man like that's most expensive possession." A pause. "That doesn't mean you owe him anything. But I think you know that what he's offering now is different from what he offered before. And I think pretending you don't know that is its own kind of dishonesty." Abigail was silent for a long moment. "I'm not ready," she said. "You don't have to be ready," Ruth said. "You just have to be honest, with yourself and with him." She picked up her cup. "That's all. The rest follows from that." Abigail rode home thinking about honesty and about fear, and about the specific courage it took to remain open to a person who had hurt you, not because they deserved it automatically, but because closing yourself entirely was its own kind of wound. She had spent years closed off from her own life, her own needs, her own rights. She was not going to close herself off from the possibility of being seen just because the first man who genuinely tried to see her had started late. She was going to be careful. She was going to be slow, but she was going to be open. The men William sent on Monday were good workers. She assessed them inside of 20 minutes and adjusted her instructions accordingly. They corrected the fence line with the efficiency of people who'd been told clearly what was expected and given the right tools to do it. And by midday, the south boundary of the Holloway farm ran true for the first time since the Harrington property had been surveyed wrong 9 years ago. William did not come himself. She'd half expected he might, and half hoped he wouldn't, and the fact that he'd sent his men and stayed away told her something she stored and didn't yet name. Caroline came instead. Not on that Monday, 3 days later, unannounced, riding up the lane in the late afternoon with a covered basket over her arm, and the expression of someone who had rehearsed their opening line and then lost confidence in it on the road. Abigail was at the desk in the farmhouse when she heard the horse. She came to the door. Caroline held up the basket. "I made cornbread," she said. "I know you've been out here working through supper." Abigail looked at her sister, at the basket, at the careful, uncertain face above it, the face of a young woman who was learning slowly, and not painlessly, that the world did not automatically soften for people who had been beautiful and accommodated their whole lives. "Come in," Abigail said. They sat at the farmhouse table and ate cornbread in the early evening. Not the best cornbread Abigail had ever had, because Caroline was not a practiced cook, but made with evident effort, which counted for something. They didn't talk about William directly. They talked about the farm, and about their father, and about a letter Caroline had received from a cousin in Philadelphia, who was apparently very enthusiastic about the city's musical life. It was almost comfortable, not what they'd been before they were past that, and Abigail thought maybe they'd been past it for years without admitting it. But something new, tentative, built from a more honest foundation. Two women talking across a table, doing the slow work of relearning each other without the old arrangements in between. At the door as she was leaving, Caroline turned and said, "William asked about you." Abigail kept her face steady. "Did he? He asked if I thought you were all right, out here alone." Caroline searched her face. "I told him you were the most all-right person I'd ever met." "That's generous." "It's accurate." Caroline looked at her with something that was neither guilt nor apology anymore, something cleaner, more like the genuine attention of a younger sister who was growing up. "He's different, Abby. Something in him has—" She paused, choosing carefully, opened. "I see it. I don't think I caused it." Abigail was quiet. "I know I'm not the right person to be saying this," Caroline said. "And I'm not saying it to push you toward anything. I'm saying it because you deserve accurate information, and because I owe you that much at least." Abigail looked at her sister for a long moment. "Thank you for the cornbread," she said. Caroline nodded. She rode away down the lane, and Abigail stood in the doorway of her farmhouse and thought about what had just happened, not just the conversation, but the fact of it. The fact of her sister bringing her cornbread and honest information and leaving without asking for anything in return. That was new. That was real. She went back inside and sat at her desk and did not do any more work that evening. She just sat and thought and listened to the sounds of the farm settling into night. The twist came from a direction she hadn't expected, as the real ones always do. It was not William. It was not Caroline. It was not even her father, who had been quietly, carefully trying to be better in the particular way of people who can't say the big thing directly, but can show it in the small daily things. The way he'd started asking her opinion on Carter Ridge decisions he'd previously simply made, the way he'd taken to leaving her coffee at her door in the mornings without comment or ceremony. It was Mrs. Harrington, William's mother. Eleanor Harrington was 63 years old and had been, by the county's general consensus, the true power behind the Harrington property since her husband's death 15 years ago, regardless of whose name appeared on the deed. She was a small woman, not physically impressive, but possessed of the quality that certain people develop over long years of being underestimated, a kind of compressed authority that expanded to fill every room she entered without apparent effort. She arrived at the Holloway farm on a Tuesday morning in the second week of August in a carriage with no advance word. Abigail was inside reviewing the planting schedule when she heard the wheels. She went to the door. Eleanor Harrington stepped down from the carriage without assistance and walked up the path to the farmhouse, with the steady, unhurried pace of a woman who had decided to come, and had therefore come, and was not particularly interested in what anyone thought about it. "Miss Carter," she said. "Mrs. Harrington." Abigail opened the door wider. "Come in." Eleanor came in. She sat at the farmhouse table with the immediate comfort of someone who was at home in any chair she chose to sit in, and she looked around the room at the books, the maps, the organized evidence of a working life, with an expression that Abigail couldn't read quickly. "I'll say what I came to say," Eleanor said. I'm not young, and I don't have patience for preamble. I appreciate that, Abigail said, and meant it. My son handled you badly. Eleanor folded her hands on the table. Not viciously, he's not a vicious man, but badly in the way that careful men are sometimes bad without knowing it, which is its own kind of unkindness. She looked at Abigail directly. He told you what you were to him in function, and not what you could have been in fact. And I allowed the arrangement because I thought it was practical, and because practical arrangements have served this family well, and because— She paused very briefly. I didn't ask myself what it was serving you. Abigail sat across from her and said nothing. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Eleanor continued. That's not why I'm here. I'm here because my son has spent the last 6 weeks becoming someone I didn't know he had in him, and I think— She paused again, shorter this time, more deliberate. I think you are responsible for that. Not because you're trying to be, because of who you are, and because he finally had to reckon with it. The morning was still outside. A bird somewhere. The sound of James Sutton arriving at the east field. Ordinary sounds of an ordinary working morning. Mrs. Harrington, Abigail said carefully, what is it you want from me? Eleanor looked at her with those compressed, experienced eyes. Nothing, she said. I want nothing from you. I came to tell you that whatever you decide to let him in, or to keep him at that fence line, you should decide it knowing clearly what's on offer. A pause. He is not offering you the arrangement he offered before. He knows that won't do, and I think he finally understands why. She stood. I also came to tell you that you have done something remarkable on this land in a very short time, and that I respect it, and that I wanted to say so to your face, because I should have said something of that kind a long time ago. She walked to the door. She turned back once. Your mother was a good woman, she said. I didn't know her as well as I should have, another mistake of the practical kind. She nodded. Good morning, Miss Carter. She left. Abigail sat at her table for a long time after the carriage wheels faded. She was thinking about Eleanor Harrington sitting across from her and saying, I didn't ask myself what it was serving you saying it plainly without decoration as a statement of fact about a failure she'd made and was now accounting for. She was thinking about how rare that was. How genuinely specifically rare, not just in men, but in anyone. The willingness to say I got it wrong, and here is exactly where, and I'm not asking you to absolve me, I'm just naming it clearly. She thought about Ruth, who had held a leather satchel for 6 years because Helena Carter had trusted her to. She thought about her father leaving coffee at her door. She thought about Caroline making cornbread. She thought about William Harrington signing 12 acres away without a word, and sending men to fix her fence, and standing at the boundary line with his hat in his hands, and looking up at her on the roof with that expression that was both exasperated, and she could name it. Now she was ready to name it, something close to wonder. She was loved by none of these people perfectly, but she was being seen by them more clearly, slowly, imperfectly, than she had been before. And she had learned at the Holloway farm in these weeks of building her own life from the ground up that clarity was harder to come by than perfection, and worth more when you found it. She stood up. She went to find William Harrington. Not at his house. She wasn't ready for that. Wasn't ready for the weight of his territory around a conversation that needed to be on equal ground. She rode to the boundary line. Their boundary line, the fence that now ran true. He wasn't there. She dismounted and waited. She was not surprised, 15 minutes later, when she heard hooves, and looked up, and he was coming from the direction of his own fields, as though something had told him, instinct or habit, or the particular attunement that develops between people who have been circling each other long enough that she would be here. He pulled up. He looked at her. I spoke with your mother this morning, she said. He got down from his horse. I didn't send her, he said immediately. I want to be clear about that. I know you didn't. He came to stand on his side of the fence. The distance between them was exactly what it had been every time they'd stood here a fence's width a few feet. Nothing and everything. What did she say? He asked. She said you've become someone she didn't know you had in you. Abigail looked at him steadily. She said I was responsible for it. Something moved across his face. Not embarrassment, something more complex. The look of a man hearing a truth about himself said aloud by someone else, and finding it more precise than he'd expected. "She's not wrong," he said. "I know." A pause. "I need to tell you something, William." She used his name without deciding to. It came out of its own accord, and she let it stand. "I cannot be the person I was going to be in that arrangement. That woman is gone. She left the ring on the table, and she didn't come back." "I don't want her back," he said. Quickly, with a force that surprised her. "Let me finish." She kept her voice level. "I have spent 6 weeks building something of my own, and I intend to keep building it: this farm, this life, this independence. That doesn't stop for anyone. It doesn't adjust to accommodate anyone's convenience." She held his gaze. "I am not available to be managed or organized into someone's household or told that my value is in what I can provide. If you cannot see me outside of those terms, then this conversation ends here, and we remain neighbors in good standing and nothing more." He was quiet for long enough that she heard the meadowlark again and the creek somewhere below them, and the sound of the summer she'd been living in, like it was the first real one she'd been given. "I see you," he said. "I see who you are, not what you can do, who you are." He stepped closer to the fence, not crossing it, but close enough that the distance collapsed to something more intentional. "I know that's not enough to say. I know it has to be shown. I know it's going to take time, and I know you have every right to make it take a long time." His voice was stripped of its authority, stripped of its management, just a man's voice in the morning speaking the plainest thing he knew. "I'm asking for the chance to show it. Not to earn what was before that was wrong and it's gone. To start something that's—" He stopped, seemed to search for the word and find it: actual. Abigail looked at him. She thought about Ruth saying, "It's a start." She thought about everything that start had already meant: the fence posts and the soil drainage and the 12 acres and the hat in his hands and his mother at her table saying, "I didn't ask what it was serving you." She thought about the woman who had left a ring on a table 6 weeks ago, and about the woman standing here now at her own fence, on her own land, speaking her own terms. They were the same woman. That was the point. That was the thing she'd needed to prove to herself, not to him, not to the county, not to Martha Pendleton, or Mrs. Aiken, or anyone, to herself. She had proved it, proved. "You can come to the East Field on Thursday," she said. "James Sutton needs a second opinion on the row spacing for the spring plan. I'd like to hear yours." He didn't smile. He did something more restrained than that, a small release of tension around his eyes, the particular quality of relief that doesn't perform itself, because it's too genuine for performance. "Thursday," he said. "And Mr. Harrington." She gathered her reins. "Come ready to work. I don't have time for men who stand around watching." "Yes, ma'am," he said. It was the first time he'd said that to her. Ma'am, the simple respect of the vernacular offered straight without irony. She felt it land somewhere in her chest, and chose not to examine exactly where. She rode back toward the farmhouse. Behind her, she heard him standing at the fence for a moment. Before he moved, she could tell by the silence the particular shape of someone staying still, because they don't quite want to move yet, because the moment is worth standing inside for a few seconds longer. She understood that. She felt it herself. But she kept riding because she was Abigail Carter, and she had work to do, and Thursday was 2 days away. And between now and then, there was winter wheat to plan, and ledgers to balance, and a chimney cap to assess again, because she suspected James Sutton had nudged it crooked when he came up to check it on Monday. Her farm was waiting. She went to it. Thursday came the way important days usually do, without announcement, dressed up as ordinary. Abigail was already in the East Field when William arrived. She heard his horse on the lane and kept doing what she was doing, which was reviewing James Sutton's row markers, with the focused attention of someone who had not spent the previous 2 days thinking about Thursday at all, which was not entirely true, but was the version she intended to present. James looked up when William rode in and tied his horse at the fence post. James was not a man who offered opinions about things that weren't his business, which was one of the primary reasons Abigail valued him. He simply nodded at William, looked at Abigail, and waited. "Mr. Harrington?" Abigail said without looking up from the marker she was checking. "The row spacing question is at the south end. James will show you what we've got. I want your honest assessment, not a polite one." "Understood," William said. He went with James. She listened to them talk the particular rhythm of two men discussing land which was direct and specific and unadorned in a way that she'd always found clarifying. No performance in it, just the work. After 20 minutes, William came back with James behind him. "Your spacing is correct for winter wheat," he said. "But you're going to have a problem with the north row if that low corner doesn't drain completely before first frost. The ground there holds water longer than it looks like it should. I've had the same issue on my east parcel for years." "What did you do about it?" she asked. "Cut a secondary channel along the field edge 3 feet deep angled toward the main drainage cut. Takes a day's labor." He paused. "My men know the technique. I can send them Friday if you'd like." "Thursday's already nearly gone," she said. "Send them Monday." "Monday," he agreed. They stood in the field for a moment, the three of them in the August heat, in the ordinary silence of people who have work in front of them and know how to stand in a working quiet without filling it unnecessarily. Then James found something to do on the other side of the field, as James consistently found something to do at precisely the right moments, which Abigail had begun to suspect was not accidental. "Walk with me," she said to William. They walked the field boundary, not touching a careful foot of space between them but side by side, and that was its own thing. She showed him the north corner she'd been watching. He showed her where the water was likely collecting underground, based on the slope. They disagreed about the depth of the secondary channel. She thought 3 feet was excessive. He thought 2.5 was insufficient. And they argued about it with the specific energized friction of two people who knew what they were talking about and were not going to concede a point they believed was correct just to be agreeable. He did not concede because she was a woman. She did not concede because he was a man. They arrived eventually at 2 feet 9 inches, which pleased neither of them entirely, and which was therefore probably right. "You're stubborn," he said as they came back around to the starting point. "I'm accurate," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her sideways. "You've said that before." It bears repeating, and there it was. The smallest thing, a shared echo, a callback to a conversation they'd had standing at the fence with the morning between them. His mouth curved. Not the social smile, not the managed expression. The real one, brief and unguarded, that she'd seen appearing more frequently, and which she was beginning to understand was his actual face underneath the other one. She felt something loosen in her chest that she didn't try to tighten back up. She let it stand. He came back on Monday with his men for the drainage channel, and on Wednesday because the boundary fence needed one more adjustment she hadn't gotten to. And the following Monday, because he had a question about the surveyor's notes she'd mentioned. And then because it stopped having reasons exactly and started having a rhythm. Instead, the way real things do when they stop being efforts and become habits. August moved around them. The county kept watching. Abigail had long accepted that the county would watch, and had equally accepted that the county's watching was not a factor in her decisions. Mrs. Aiken had by the second week of August shifted her public position from what a peculiar woman to, well, I always did say, Abigail Carter had a remarkable mind for land management, which was the kind of social revision that required no acknowledgement and received none from Abigail. Ruth Miller said one morning over coffee, "People are calling it the Carter farm now, not the Holloway parcel." "I know," Abigail said. "How does that feel?" Abigail thought about it. "Like something that belongs to me," she said, "which is the point." Ruth smiled, the full one, the kind she didn't spend freely. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly the point." It was at Ruth's the following week that Abigail found out about Caroline. She hadn't planned to. It came up sideways the way information about people you love often does, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely. Ruth mentioned casually that she'd seen Caroline in town with a young man named Daniel Marsh, Lucy Marsh's younger brother, a quietly serious person who'd been apprenticing with a surveyor out of Richmond and who had apparently struck up a friendship with Caroline at a church social 3 weeks prior. Abigail set her cup down. Caroline hasn't mentioned him. Caroline's probably not sure how you'll receive it, Ruth said, given everything. I'm not going to be unkind about my sister having feelings for someone. I know that, Ruth said, but Caroline doesn't fully know it yet. She's still learning that you're different people now than you were before the ball. That's going to take some time. Abigail rode home thinking about Caroline and Daniel Marsh, and about the strange way lives reorganize themselves after a rupture. How the pieces don't fall back into the old shapes but into new ones, and sometimes the new shapes are better fits for the actual people involved, even if the rupture itself costs something real. She stopped by the Carter house that evening. Caroline was in the parlor. She looked up when Abigail came in, and the expression on her face went through 3 things in rapid succession: surprise, a flicker of something cautious, and then the particular look of someone preparing to explain themselves. Ruth told me, Abigail said before Caroline could begin, about Daniel Marsh. Caroline's hands went still in her lap. Abby. He's a good family. Daniel's a serious person from what I've heard. Abigail sat down across from her. Tell me about him. It took Caroline a full 5 seconds to shift gears from defensive to genuine, which Abigail thought was fair, given the recent history. But when she shifted, she really shifted, and Abigail spent the next half hour listening to her sister talk about a young man with ink on his fingers, and a steady way of listening, and she felt watching Caroline's face come alive in the telling that whatever had been broken between them was not beyond repair, just changed, reorganized into a different shape. Are you really not angry? Caroline asked at the end. About Daniel Marsh, Abigail said. No, Caroline. I'm glad for you. About all of it. Abigail looked at her sister for a long, honest moment. I'm not angry anymore, she said. I was. I needed to be for a while. But anger was what I needed to get out of a life that wasn't mine, and I've done that now. She paused. What I want from you going forward is the honesty we didn't have before. That's all. Caroline nodded. Her eyes were bright. I can do that. I know you can. Abigail stood. Bring him to Sunday supper sometime. Papa should meet him. She left Caroline in the parlor, looking for the first time in weeks, like herself. The first real frost warning came in late September, early by any standard, and enough to send everyone with crops in the ground into a focused, efficient panic. Abigail was at the Carter farm already when Samuel came riding over from the Holloway property with word that the north corner drainage wasn't running clear, and the wheat was at risk if the temperature dropped overnight. She rode to the Holloway farm in under 15 minutes. She was assessing the drainage cut when William's horse came up the lane at a pace that told her he'd heard, and come without waiting to be asked. He dismounted before the horse fully stopped and was beside her at the drainage cut in a handful of strides, and for the next 3 hours, they worked, she and William and James and Henry Sutton, and 2 of William's men in the gray late afternoon cold, clearing the channel cutting the secondary run she'd initially thought was too deep, and now understood was precisely right, covering the most vulnerable section of the north row with feed sacks they sent Henry to retrieve from the barn. Nobody managed anybody. Everybody just worked. By the time the light failed completely, the wheat was as protected as it could be, and they stood at the field edge in the dark and cold, and Abigail ran the arithmetic in her head and decided it was going to be all right. Thank you, she said to all of them, James Henry Williams' men. And then, because he was standing closest and because it was accurate to William directly, thank you. He was dirty from the channel work, which she had never seen before, William Harrington with clay on his coat, and his hair pushed back and his hands showing the work. He looked at her and said simply, "The wheat's going to hold." "I know," she said. "I calculated it." He looked at her for a long moment in the dark. "You always calculate it," he said, and the way he said it, not as a complaint, not as an observation of something inconvenient, but with a warmth that was close to admiration, made her stand very still for a second. James coughed diplomatically. Everyone found reasons to move toward the barn. She and William stood alone at the edge of the field. "Abigail," he said. She had been waiting for this, not dreading it, not anymore, but aware it was coming the way you're aware of weather changing before it changes. She'd been aware for 2 weeks, maybe 3, that they were building toward a moment that wasn't about drainage channels, or fence lines, or soil spacing. "Say what you came to say," she said. He turned to face her fully. In the dark, stripped of the usual daytime visibility of expression, she could hear his voice more clearly than she normally did. Every variation in it, every place where the management fell away. "I have been for the past 9 weeks trying to show you something," he said. "I don't know if I've done it well enough. I don't know if enough time has passed. I don't know what you're going to say." A pause. "But I have spent 40 years of my life making certain calculations, and I am not willing to make this one. I am not going to calculate whether the time is right, or the circumstances are optimal, or whether I have demonstrated sufficient." He stopped and started again, and this version was quieter and more real. "I love you, Abigail. Not the version of you that was useful to me, you. This woman who fixes her own chimney cap and argues about channel depth and handles 12 acres of bad news with more grace than I've shown in most of my life. I love who you are, and I want to stand beside that, not in front of it, not behind it, beside it for whatever time I'm given." He was quiet for exactly 1 beat. "That's what I came to say." The field was dark and cold and still. Abigail stood inside the silence and felt it, the weight of it, the realness of it, the way it was different from everything she'd been offered before. Not a business arrangement spoken across a dining table. Not a practical selection made for its convenience. A man standing in a dark field, with clay on his coat, saying the true thing without managing it, and leaving the space for whatever she chose to do next entirely open. She thought about the ring on the table. She thought about the morning she'd stood at the Holloway boundary and decided to find out who she was. She thought about 17 pages in her mother's handwriting, and Ruth Miller's coffee, and a chimney cap, and 2 feet 9 inches, and the specific expression on William Harrington's face when he'd looked up at her on the roof and found her there. "I know," she said. He waited. "I know you do," she said. "I've known for a while. I was making certain I knew my own mind before I said anything about yours." She looked at him in the dark. "I am not the woman who left that ring on the table. She's gone, and I'm glad she's gone. I'm this woman, the one who built something, the one who argued you down to 2 feet 9 inches, the one who is not available to organize herself around someone else's needs." She paused. "But I am also a woman who has been watching you for 9 weeks become something more honest than you were. And I find that I—" She stopped. Let herself say it plainly. "I love who you're becoming. And I think I loved what was underneath before if you'd ever let me see it." A breath. "So yes, beside me. Not for me, not in front of me. Beside." He reached across and took her hand. Not in the formal way, the curated gesture of a man performing romance, but the way you reach for something real, because you're afraid for one more second it might not be there. His hand was cold from the fieldwork, and she held it anyway. "Beside," he said. "Beside," she agreed. They stood at the edge of the field that was hers in the cold Virginia dark. And it was not like the stories, not grand, not staged, not the kind of moment that announced itself. It was just 2 people deciding quietly and clearly to be honest with each other going forward, which was the only foundation that had ever held anything worth keeping. The twist came 6 days later, and it came from the county itself. There was a land hearing, a formal proceeding at the county courthouse, called by a group of neighboring landowners who had decided now that the Holloway boundary adjustment had been officially recorded, and the Carter farm name had begun appearing in the county land records under Abigail's stewardship, to contest the original trust terms on the grounds that a woman managing independent property without a husband or male guardian was contrary to established custom and the stability of the county's land arrangements. The leader of this effort was a man named Robert Aldwell, 55 heavyset, with the particular pomposity of someone who had confused the length of time he'd held an opinion with its validity. He owned the property to the north of the Carter farm, and he had not in 30 years of prosperous land ownership been told by a woman where a boundary ran. Mr. Prescott brought Abigail word on a Monday morning, and to his credit, he delivered it directly and without cushioning. "The hearing is Friday," he said. "The grounds are thin, the trust documentation is solid, but Aldwell has 3 supporters on the county board, and I want you to understand what you'll be walking into." "I understand," Abigail said. She was not afraid. That surprised her slightly. She had expected fear, and instead found something harder and steadier. She sat down that evening and went through every document in the leather satchel, cross-referenced against her own notes from the land office, and identified the 4 specific points on which Aldwell's challenge was most likely to rest and the exact evidence that addressed each one. She wrote to Mr. Prescott that night. She also wrote to Ruth, and she wrote without planning to Eleanor Harrington a brief formal letter stating the facts and asking nothing. Just informing woman to woman because Eleanor had sat at her table and named her failure directly, and that deserved to be answered in kind. Eleanor's response came back the next morning. It said, "I will be at the courthouse on Friday. Bring every document you have. I have attended 17 land hearings in this county in 40 years, and I have never yet seen a well-documented claim fail in the face of an undocumented grievance. Be accurate. Be calm. Let the paper speak." Abigail read it twice. She thought this is what women have had to be for a very long time. Twice as prepared, twice as calm, twice as documented. She felt the weight of it not as defeat, but as the clear-eyed acknowledgement of the actual terrain. And then she set the letter down and went back to her documents because clarity about the terrain was only useful if you used it to navigate. William came by that evening. She told him about the hearing. Before he could ask, she could see in his face that he'd already heard, because the county never held news longer than 24 hours, and she wanted to say it first on her own terms. "I want to be there," he said. "You don't need to be." "I know I don't need to be." His voice was steady, not pressing, not managing. "I want to be. There's a difference." She looked at him. She thought about how many times she'd made that distinction herself between what someone needed from her and what she was choosing to give. It was a different thing entirely to be on the receiving end of it. "All right," she said. "You can be there." "And Abigail." He met her eyes. "I'm not coming to defend you. You don't need defending. I'm coming because I want the county to see us standing in the same place." She held that for a moment. "That's," she started. "The right framing," he offered. "Yes," she said. "That's the right framing." And Friday arrived. The county courthouse was a single-story building at the center of town that smelled of old wood and official documents, and the specific combination of consequence and tedium that characterized all legal proceedings in small counties. By 9 in the morning, the room was fuller than Abigail had expected. She had expected Aldwell and his 3 supporters. She had expected Mr. Prescott and Ruth and William, and possibly her father, who had said the night before in his particular understated way that he intended to be present, and that he had written a formal statement acknowledging the validity of the trust transfer and his own role in delaying it, which he would submit to the board on request. She had not expected the women. They came in 1s and 2s, settling into the back rows of the room farm wives, merchant widows, the Fitch girl who was 19 and had apparently told her father she was going to the dry goods store, Lucy Marsh. Young Ellen Hodge, who was 17 and had been watching Ruth, had said, and taking notes. 3 women whose names Abigail didn't know, but whose faces she recognized from church, and more behind them. They didn't speak. They didn't carry signs. They simply came in and sat down, and the room shifted around them in a way that Aldwell, who had been arranging his papers at the front with the confidence of a man who expected an audience of other men, clearly had not anticipated. Ruth sat in the second row and met Abigail's eyes when she came in and gave her a single nod that meant "You see it." Good. William was already there beside her father on the left side of the room. He stood when she came in. Not the formal courtesy, the automatic thing, but a deliberate stand visible to everyone in the room, saying without a word, where he stood, and beside whom. Eleanor Harrington was in the front row. She had dressed for the occasion in the particular way of women who understood that appearance was sometimes the first argument and sometimes the last. She looked at Abigail when she came in and inclined her head once, an acknowledgement between equals precisely calibrated. Abigail sat down at the table across from Aldwell and arranged her documents. Aldwell leaned across and said in the tone of a man offering a kindness, "Miss Carter, there's no dishonor in withdrawing a claim that was perhaps made in haste. A woman in your position—" "Mr. Aldwell," she said, without raising her voice or looking up from her papers. "The hearing hasn't started yet. Save your arguments for the board." He blinked. He sat back. The board chairman, a cautious man named Whitmore, called the proceeding to order. What followed was 2 hours of the most focused, documented, unambiguous presentation Abigail Carter had ever made in her life. Not because she was performing for the room. She was not performing, she was presenting, but because she had spent 27 years developing the capacity for exactly this. Taking a complicated situation, understanding it completely, and explaining it with the clear precision of someone who knew the difference between what something appeared to be and what it actually was. She laid out the trust documentation. She laid out the grandfather's original terms. She laid out the codicil and its proper legal weight. She laid out Mr. Prescott's timeline and her father's signed acknowledgement. She addressed each of Aldwell's 4 points before he made them. She'd anticipated them exactly, and she did it without heat, without drama, without the trembling performance of a woman asking for mercy. She was not asking for mercy. She was stating facts. Aldwell made his arguments anyway. They were thinner than she'd anticipated, which told her reading the room that he'd expected her to be unprepared. The board conferred for 11 minutes. Whitmore cleared his throat. He looked at Abigail. He looked at Aldwell. He looked at the room at the back rows, the women who had come to sit and witness without saying a word, and she thought she saw something move across his face that was not political calculation, but something closer to conscience. The documentation submitted by Miss Carter is comprehensive, legally sound, and fully supported by the county land records as administered by Mr. Prescott, he said. The trust terms established by the late Josiah Holloway are valid and binding. The claim to stewardship by Miss Abigail Carter of the Holloway property is confirmed. This board finds no legal basis for the challenge brought by Mr. Aldwell. Claim stands. The room was absolutely silent for 1 full second. Then Ruth Miller said from the second row, in a perfectly ordinary voice, "Good." And that was all. No applause, no scene, no dramatic moment. Just one woman's word landing in the silence and filling it completely. Aldwell gathered his papers and left without speaking. His 3 supporters followed. The room began to move, to breathe, to fill with the ordinary sounds of people getting up and talking. Eleanor Harrington stood, caught Abigail's eye, and nodded once more, the same precise acknowledgement as before, but with something added to it now. Something that looked, in its restrained way, like pride. Her father crossed the room and stood beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just stood there in his good coat beside his daughter in the courthouse, where he'd done business for 30 years. "Your mother would have come in this morning," he said quietly, "and sat in that front row and looked exactly like you looked." Abigail looked at him. "I know," she said. And she did. William waited until the room had mostly cleared. He came to where she was still standing at the table gathering her documents, her case, her victory. That was not a performance but a fact, and he stood beside her, not in front, not behind, beside. "You didn't need any of us," he said. "No," she agreed. "I'm glad we were here anyway." "So am I," she said, and meant it completely. The autumn came in, honestly, after that cool and clear, the way Virginia could be in October, when it decided to cooperate, the sky high and pale blue and the fields turning. The winter wheat was holding. The drainage channel had done its work. The Holloway farmhouse was warm and tight, and Abigail had, by the second week of October, moved her full working life out to it. Not running from Carter Ridge, but moving toward her own place, which was different, and which her father had finally said, sitting in the kitchen, the evening she brought the last of her books over, was the right thing. "I should have given you this 2 years ago," he said. 3 years ago. "Yes," she said. "You should have." "I'm sorry, Abigail." She looked at her father, 60 years old, sitting at his own kitchen table, without his daughter to run the house and choosing to be here anyway. Choosing to say the thing directly instead of circling around it. "I know you are," she said. "I believe you." She poured him a cup of coffee and set it in front of him. "And I think you can manage Carter Ridge, Papa. You've been doing it alongside me for 7 years. You know more than you've let yourself know." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "You'll come to Sunday supper." "I'll come to Sunday supper." "And you'll bring William." She looked at him. He looked back steady, a little guilty, entirely genuine. "He's a good man, Abigail. Not because of his land or his position, because of what he's been doing these past weeks." He paused. "I should have paid more attention to what kind of man he was before I shook his hand over your future. That was my failure, but I'm paying attention now." She sat down across from him and thought that this was what it looked like when people tried, not perfectly, not without the evidence of their failures still visible, but genuinely with the work showing in their faces. "I'll bring William to Sunday supper," she said. "If he'd like to come." He would like to come. She knew that already. She rode home in the October dark with the stars clear overhead and the smell of wood smoke from her own chimney, her chimney properly capped, and she felt the fullness of the season, the fullness of the life she'd been building, the weight and the rightness of it. William was waiting at the lane. Not inside, she hadn't given him a key, and she wouldn't yet, but he'd taken to meeting her at the end of the lane in the evening sometimes, which she had not discouraged, because there was a difference between privacy and solitude, and she had always known the difference. He fell into step beside her horse as she walked it to the barn. "How was he?" he asked. He meant her father. He always tracked the things she'd mentioned. "Better," she said. "Trying." She dismounted. "He wants you to come to Sunday supper." "Does he?" "He said you're a good man. He said he's paying attention now." William was quiet for a moment, taking this in. "I should have deserved that assessment earlier," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "You should have, but you deserve it now, and that matters." She handed him the reins, not because she needed him to hold the horse, but because it was something to hand across a small ordinary trust. It's not the same as deserving it always, but it's real. He took the reins. He held her gaze in the dark. "Abigail," he said, "I want to ask you something. Not the way I asked before, not at a dining table, not as a business matter, not with your father's hand in it." He stopped. Let the simplicity of it stand without ornament. "Will you marry me? As yourself for yourself, on whatever terms you name. I am asking you, not your family, not your land, not the version of you that makes my household efficient. You." She stood in the dark outside her barn, on her land, in her life. She thought about the ring on the table. She thought about that morning at the Holloway boundary when she'd said, "I'm going to find out." She had found out. She knew exactly who she was, now not perfectly, not without more finding out still ahead, but clearly, clearly enough. She looked at William Harrington, this man who had been wrong and had done the work of being less wrong, who had stood at fence lines and signed documents and come to a courthouse to stand beside her, and was standing here now in the dark asking the right question, finally, in the right way. "Yes," she said. "On my terms." "Your terms," he said immediately and without hesitation. "Always." She took the reins back from him and led her horse into the barn. "Come to Sunday supper," she said over her shoulder. "We'll discuss the terms then." He stood in the lane and she heard him. Heard the breath of a man who had been holding something for a long time and had finally been allowed to set it down. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and Abigail Carter, who had walked out of a ballroom with nothing but her mother's ring and her own clear eyes, who had built a farm from neglected land, and built a life from the wreckage of what other people had decided she was, who had stood in a courthouse and let the paper speak and let the truth hold, smiled to herself in the dark of her own barn, beside her own horse on her own land. She had not been rescued. She had not been completed. She had been seen finally by a man who had learned to look, and she had chosen him not because she needed him, but because she was whole enough now to know the difference between needing someone and wanting them beside you, and that difference was everything. She had walked away from what diminished her. She had built what belonged to her. She had stayed open when it would have been easier to close, and in doing so, she had become fully and without apology exactly who she had always been. Abigail Carter did not need anyone to complete her story. She had written it herself. One boundary line, one honest word, one clear-eyed choice at a time, and it was hers from the first page to the last, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.